You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. Between two-factor authentication, strong passwords, and a VPN, you try to be in control of how your info is protected. But many other places also have it, and they might not be as careful. That's why LifeLock monitors hundreds of millions of data points a second for threats. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit lifelock.com/podcast for 40% off. Terms apply.
In 1932, the Times Literary Supplement published evidence that questions about Shakespeare's authorship had arisen decades earlier than the mid-19th century, when they had previously been thought to have appeared. The paper published was from a small 1805 meeting of the Ipswich Philosophical Society, at which one James Courtenay Cowell presented the 18th century findings of a clergyman named James Wilmot, who lived near Stratford-upon-Avon and had conducted some research into Shakespeare. According to this document, the Reverend Wilmot around 1795 had gone in search of books that belonged to Shakespeare and had been surprised to not find any in the private libraries of the area. He had been further unsettled not to find anyone able to offer any clear anecdotes about the playwright. Perhaps this Wilmot should not have thought it so odd, since he was asking for anecdotes nearly 180 years after the man's death, and more than 130 years after the last of his surviving family had passed away. But regardless, the Reverend apparently found this suspicious enough that he decided the Shakespeare of Stratford must not have really been the author of the works attributed to him, and instead, he leapt to the conclusion that it must instead have been Sir Francis Bacon, who was a true genius and luminary of the same years, and who would certainly have had the knowledge of court life that it seemed Shakespeare must have had. But Reverend Wilmot was disturbed by his theory, and he burned all of his research, or at least that is the story that Cowell tells in his paper to the Ipswich Society, claiming that he only knew about Wilmot's conclusions because the Reverend had confided in him. At the time that this document appeared in the 1930s, this was no revolutionary idea, having been popularized in the middle of the previous century. It certainly was curious, though, that this document came from the collection of a devout Baconian, someone thoroughly convinced that Bacon was the real Shakespeare. Naturally, considering the long history of forgeries related to Shakespeare, this too would need to be authenticated. A biography of Wilmot seemed to confirm that he was who the document said he was, that he did admire Bacon, and that he had actually consigned his papers to be burned. However, this biography was written by, it turns out, a forger who would later make false claims of having been born into royalty. Her claims about Wilmot burning his papers don't appear to have been true, and moreover, there was no indication even in this unreliable source that Wilmot had ever conducted research into Shakespeare, nor that he had ever had a meeting with James Cowell. Indeed, no strong evidence for the existence of this James Cowell had even turned up. Curious, the author of my principal source, Contested Will, scholar James Shapiro, examined the document printed in 1932 in the Times Literary Supplement, and based on its use of anachronistic language, its knowledge of details that had not been discovered at the time, and other errors, determined that it was likely a hoax. Indeed, there is a long history to the claims that Sir Francis Bacon was the author of Shakespeare's works, but not so long a history as this forgery would claim. Just as those who were desperate for some historical evidence to corroborate their conceptions of Shakespeare had resorted to many a forgery over the years, so too have those who are desperate to lend credibility to claims that Bacon authored Shakespeare. Because without some earlier proponent of the theory, it is often pointed out that the first person to come up with it had been a mad spinster, also named Bacon. This is Historical Blindness. I'm Nathaniel Lloyd, and while in the first part of this special weekly series I told you about how Shakespeare became deified and then became a target of the same rhetoric that godless scholars use to cast doubt on religious text, In this installment, I share the story of Shakespeare's first apostate, whose work would cause others to renounce drama's God as false. Thank you for joining me for An Idle and Most False Imposition, the Shakespeare Authorship Question, Part 2, the Baconian Heresy. Before we begin, to reiterate the last episode's brief announcement, I'm trying something new with this series because I've recently found my episodes getting longer and more complicated. The conclusion to my series on Oak Island, for example, was twice as long as a usual episode and difficult to assemble, as have been other episodes I've produced in the last year. The fact I've been able to produce these longer episodes and keep to my bi-weekly schedule suggests I may be able to move to a weekly schedule. And when I was releasing episodes weekly earlier this year with my remastered versions of the first episodes, I of course saw my download numbers double. With this potential for additional ad revenue, I realized there may be potential to devote more time to the podcast. So I've decided to experiment by restructuring my episodes. While so far each installment of this series has been kind of normal length, as I move to a weekly schedule, you may find some shorter episodes. But remember that you'll be getting double the episodes every month if I pull this off. And also, please recall that when this podcast started, all of my episodes were very short and of lower quality. So once I adapt to a weekly release schedule, I'm sure we will see episodes slowly grow to the length and quality you expect, like this one. And my increased output may allow me to go full-time producing this podcast, which will allow me to devote myself more completely to the research and writing of episodes. We're in this together, so have patience as I try to take what I think is the next important step for this podcast. As always, I want to thank my newest patrons, Chai and Eugene T. Huar Jr. Also, special thanks to Christine LeBlanc for upgrading her patronage to the partner level. Thanks for your generosity, and thanks to all my patrons. Patrons of the show get access to a special feed with ad-free and exclusive minisodes. I typically release a patron exclusive around twice a month. For example, after the first part of my series on Oak Island, I released a minisode on dubious claims about why the Americas were named America. And after the second part, I released the full 2-part interview with Dr. Sean Munger, audio from which I used throughout that Oak Island series. If you hear the word minisode and think these pieces are insubstantial, they're actually fully produced and researched episodes, usually around 10 to 15 minutes in length. And I intend to keep producing around 2 a month, even if I am able to move the podcast to a weekly schedule. Patron feeds also get episodes early, and as mentioned, their episodes are not interrupted by advertisements or Patreon pitches like this. So visit patreon.com/historicalblindness and support the show. Or you can support what I do with a one-time gift donation at historicalblindness.com/donate, or at the PayPal link in the show notes, or on Venmo at historicalblindness. Now, on with the episode. Welcome to Historical Blindness. When we hear the term Renaissance, which is a French word simply meaning rebirth, we think, of course, of a time of new ideas in philosophy and new achievements in art. And we typically think of Italy. Indeed, it's often argued that the Renaissance began in Florence with the writings of Dante and Petrarch, and the art of Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Donatello, and Raphael, all the Ninja Turtles. But of course, the Renaissance was not a strictly Italian rebirth of culture, and elsewhere these developments were seen as well. In England, William Shakespeare is, of course, counted among the luminaries of Renaissance artistry, as are some of his fellow dramatists like Christopher Marlowe and Ben Jonson, and other major English poets like John Milton, Edmund Spenser, and John Donne. On the list of philosophers who contributed to this rebirth in thought in England, you may see many recognizable names like William Tyndale and Thomas More, But always atop this list you'll find Sir Francis Bacon. A true polymath, Bacon was a prolific writer on many subjects, from legal treatises to politics, to history, to the philosophy of education and knowledge, and to natural philosophy or science, in which field he is credited as a forefather of the scientific method. He wrote every kind of thing, from tracts and pamphlets to political reports and parliamentary speeches, everything but poems and plays, funny enough. He served as a counselor to Queen Elizabeth, and later in legal positions under King James, proved himself a formidable statesman as Lord High Chancellor of England. With some questionable charges of corruption in 1621, he lost his positions and was confined for a time in the Tower of London, after which he retired and passed away a few years afterward. But just as Shakespeare's star would brighten years after his death, so too would Bacon's. During the Enlightenment, the French philosophes esteemed him as a social reformer and opponent of dogmatism, and in the 19th century, he continued to be admired. Ralph Waldo Emerson heaped praise on him in much the same way he did Shakespeare, calling him, quote, an archangel to whom the high office was committed of opening the doors and palaces of knowledge to many generations, end quote. And two mysterious undertakings in Bacon's career would end up during Emerson's time, encouraging his identification with the works of Shakespeare. The first being that he had never finished his work Instauratio Magna, the Great Restoration, the final lost part of which promised to be his quote-unquote new philosophy. And the second being that he had once developed a cipher, acting as both a substitution and a concealment code that allowed messages to be hidden within texts. As you might already imagine, this would lead to claims that his lost philosophy was hidden within Shakespeare's works. With the claims about Reverend Wilmot proving doubtful, it appears that the first person to not only claim Shakespeare did not write the works attributed to him, but also to actually name Francis Bacon as their true author was Delia Salter Bacon, a remarkable Puritan woman with no relation to Francis Bacon, who had been born in a rustic log cabin in Ohio. After their Puritan community failed and her father, who had organized it, passed away, her brother was sent off to Yale, but she, who was far more intellectually gifted and eloquent than he, had to remain in their Connecticut home and support the family as a school teacher. Yet she would not be held back. She began to win short story writing contests, even beating out Edgar Allan Poe for one prize. And soon she was a popular lecturer on history in New Haven. She moved to New York City in 1836 and began to acquaint herself with the intelligentsia there, such as Samuel Morse, who was then engaged in developing Morse code, and, as Sir Francis Bacon was a figure of interest to her, spoke with her about Sir Francis Bacon's cipher. She became involved with the New York theater scene, befriending a famous Shakespearean actress, for whom she wrote a play with decidedly Shakespearean themes. After the failure of this play, she withdrew from society, beginning to develop a theory about the authorship of Shakespeare's plays that would preoccupy her for the rest of her life. During the years that she was developing this theory, she also became involved with a man whom she seemed to believe had intentions of marrying her, but when her family confronted him about his intentions, he claimed he had none and began reading their love letters to people he knew, mocking her for her unrequited expressions of affection. Since the man was a theology student intending to become a clergyman, Delia Bacon's brother actually took him to ecclesiastical court over it, claiming quote-unquote calumny and quote disgraceful conduct, end quote. The result was that Delia had to testify. Their love letters were made public, and the rumor-mongering became far worse than it ever might have otherwise been. Delia began to lose her faith over the whole affair, and she would never again be connected romantically to another man. So Delia Bacon withdrew into her studies, becoming more and more convinced of her discovery that Sir Francis Bacon had been behind the works of Shakespeare. She took the famous writer Nathaniel Hawthorne into her confidence, since he too had a family background in Puritanism. And Hawthorne thought her theory had such merit that he introduced her to Ralph Waldo Emerson. The great essayist Emerson, too, was quite impressed with Delia's writings, though he expressed his doubts about her theory quite eloquently. Quote, "You will have need of enchanted instruments, nay, alchemy itself, to melt into one identity these two reputations," end quote. Nevertheless, she was convincing, for she insisted that she had found secret evidence in Shakespeare's very works, hidden by the Baconian cipher. So convincing was she that Emerson introduced her to Thomas Carlyle, the famed historian and essayist from Scotland, and arranged for Delia to visit England to further research her theory. Of course, fleeing to England to escape the humiliation of her recent scandal greatly appealed to Delia. So she went overseas, where Carlyle actually laughed in her face about her theory, encouraging her to make use of the British Library, where the extensive materials in their collection should disabuse her of her misguided notions. But Delia Bacon was confident that there was nothing in the library to help her. Instead, she spent her time at St. Albans and Stratford, not completing archival research, but rather lurking around the tombs of Sir Francis Bacon and William Shakespeare, asking about having their crypts opened because she suspected that some secret proofs of her theory, such as the lost manuscripts, had been buried with them. According to her theory, Sir Francis Bacon, along with a coterie of co-conspirators, had chafed under royal authority, and believing that his new philosophy, which was essentially a call to throw off the yoke of monarchy for freedom and knowledge, must be directed to the people, he conspired with these others to circumvent censors and embed his philosophy within a series of plays to be put on for the public. The plays themselves proved it, she claimed. Their message about the evils of kings was Bacon's. Her evidence was much what we have heard already, that there is no record indicating the Stratford man capable of composing the works. She relied on invective, calling Shakespeare a, quote, "stupid, illiterate, third-rate play actor," end quote, while Bacon was exactly the sort of person one would expect to have written them. Both completely unsupported claims, since there's no evidence of Shakespeare's illiteracy, and in fact ample evidence that he was quite literate, and likewise no evidence that Sir Francis Bacon was capable of composing the sorts of poetry and plays she was attributing to him. Indeed, there are many other problems with the Baconian heresy, as it came to be called, other than these obvious ones. First, Delia Bacon's entire argument rested on the content of Shakespeare's plays being secretly subversive political narratives, and as examples she interpreted Julius Caesar, King Lear, and Coriolanus in such a way as to support this view. It is a remarkable work of what would later be called new historicist literary criticism, but it is too flimsy to support the conspiracy theory she imagines. She ignores dozens of other plays and all of Shakespeare's poetry, presumably because it would be a Herculean task to try to interpret all of the works according to this perspective. Moreover, even if her close readings of these plays are accurate, that the politically subversive subtext was intended by their author, that does not prove that Shakespeare, the man from Stratford-upon-Avon himself, could not have intended it. Any philosophical notions about freedom or equality or the tyranny of monarchs that Delia imagines must have come from Sir Francis Bacon were also ideas with which the playwright Shakespeare himself could have wrestled. Her presumption that a quote-unquote play actor from a modest background would not be capable of profound thought and could not possibly comprehend royal court life betrays a fundamental misunderstanding of not just Elizabethan culture, but also of human nature in her assumption that only people of high breeding could accomplish anything great, a notion that even her own career disproved. Disappointingly, though, the linchpin of her theory, the smoking gun that she always promised her patrons would clinch the argument that somehow hidden evidence of the conspiracy could be uncovered using Bacon's cipher as the key, did not appear in her writings when she published. But to be fair, some of her work was lost. She had the first of 4 essays published in Putnam's magazine. But after a Shakespeare scholar called on by the magazine to introduce the essays refused and suggested they not publish any further works of Delia's, another genuine example of scholars actually working to silence the authorship controversy, which would only fuel the fires of controversy in the future, Putnam's did back out of their deal, and when they sent the unpublished essays back to her, they were lost. Having no other copies, Delia Bacon was devastated. But she went to work on writing a full-length book on the topic, writing in poverty and anxious to the point of mental disturbance that someone would steal her theory. Indeed, after her initial essay appeared, a man in England printed a pamphlet making essentially the same claim, minus the co-conspirators. And the same year that Delia finally came out with her book, a long and maundering manifesto that again produced no smoking gun cipher as evidence, this same Englishman came out with his own book. In the end, Delia Bacon's work was a flop, as she'd feared. She was thereafter institutionalized, having been driven insane by the entire ordeal. And this, in the end, would so invalidate her theory, since it had been dreamed up by a mad woman, that future Baconians have been willing to forge precursor texts, just, it seems, to dissociate the theory from its origin. Now for a brief intermission. Every summer, I'm careful to avoid getting burned. My summer plans always include applying sunscreen so I can attend barbecues and protests without worrying about getting scorched. And when I make my plans by making phone calls, I also don't want to get burned by an outrageous wireless bill. That's why I switched to a Mint Mobile plan and saved enough to take a summer vacation. With Mint, I found no difference in speed or coverage, just a big difference in cost. And right now you can switch to a Mint wireless plan like me to avoid sweating those surprise charges and overages. You'll just be chillin' with Mint's offer of 3 months premium service on the nation's largest 5G network for just $15 a month. With high-speed data and unlimited talk and text, it might just be the coolest thing happening this summer. This year, skip breaking a sweat and breaking the bank. Get this new customer offer and your 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month at mintmobile.com/blindness. That's mintmobile.com/blindness. Upfront payment of $45 required, equivalent to $15 a month. Limited time new customer offer for first 3 months only. Speeds may slow above 35 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for details. As listeners of Historical Blindness, you're no strangers to the fact that history is a lens through which we can better understand the present. Or as Shakespeare put it, what's past is prologue. History is the indispensable context without which we cannot hope to truly understand current events. You understand that, and so do the creators of the American Scandal podcast. Every season, they immerse listeners in the biggest controversies in U.S. history, helping us understand America's dark side and learn from its troubled past. Its latest season, Ruby Ridge Standoff, delves into an incident that sowed the seeds for the rise of the modern radical right. It transports you to 1992, where in a remote corner of Idaho, federal law enforcement surround a small cabin. They've come for Randy Weaver, a survivalist who took his family to the mountains in anticipation of the apocalypse. A simple weapons charge brought the agents here, but the situation is about to explode into a deadly and tragic standoff that will later become a rallying cry for far-right extremists, fueling distrust and violent anti-government sentiment for decades. Follow American Scandal on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can binge all episodes of American Scandal's Ruby Ridge Standoff early and ad-free right now on Wondery Plus.
Shopping is hard, right? But I found a better way. Stitch Fix online personal styling makes it easy. I just give my stylist my size, style, and budget preferences. I order boxes when I want and how I want. No subscription required. And he sends just for me pieces, plus outfit recommendations and styling tips. I keep what works and send back the rest. It's so easy. Make style easy. Get started today at stitchfix.com/Spotify. That's stitchfix.com/Spotify.
Now, back to the show. Despite the initial failure of Delia Bacon's work, it proved to be something of a cult favorite, surviving not only in her own work but in the references of others. And among the converts to this Baconian cult were surprisingly some astonishing luminaries of American letters, who would try to validate the Baconian heresy as a legitimate historical view. Already, Delia Bacon had major literary figures like Hawthorne and Emerson writing about her in glowing terms, admiring her intellect and insight. After her passing, Hawthorne portrayed her as a tragic figure in Recollections of a Gifted Woman, and Emerson called her, quote, America's greatest literary producer of the past 10 years, end quote. Even if they did not subscribe to her theory, they certainly were not dismissive of her accomplishments. Soon, though, another major figure in American literature would become impressed by her, and this masterful writer, Mark Twain, would not only subscribe to her theory but also help to promulgate it. Twain had read Delia Bacon's work, and throughout his career he found himself drawn to it. Over the course of his own development as an author, he came to believe that all great fiction was by necessity autobiographical, as was his own. Tom Sawyer, for example, drawn from his own childhood experiences in Mississippi. Therefore, he was amenable to the notion that Shakespeare must have written his plays from personal experience, and that since he had no personal experience of court life, the man from Stratford could not have written them. Twain also knew a thing or two about writing personas, as the riverboat pilot Samuel Clemens had not only written under a pseudonym, but also cultivated a character to go with the name. So he imagined that he knew something of what Francis Bacon had done in creating the playwright persona of Shakespeare. And there was no shortage of works to encourage Twain in his thinking during these years, as countless anonymous pamphlets and articles in major magazines appeared during the decades after Delia Bacon's work, picking up where she had left off, crafting clever arguments in an effort to prove her thesis, or some version of it, as well as to challenge it. In 1886, the Francis Bacon Society began to publish their journal, Baconiana, in whose pages the Baconian heresy would be heartily endorsed and fleshed out. Then in 1888, Twain himself published the first major book-length work on the topic since those of Delia Bacon and her plagiarist. This work, The Great Cryptogram, Francis Bacon's cipher in the so-called Shakespeare plays, was written by Ignatius Donnelly, a Minnesota congressman who had found fame writing about Atlantis and ancient catastrophes. Today, Donnelly is known as a major figure in the history of pseudo-history and pseudoscience. I mentioned him as a precursor to Immanuel Velikovsky in my series on chronological revisionists because of his fringe catastrophist views of ancient history. And certainly I will be discussing him again whenever I get around to tackling the massive myth of Atlantis. It is unsurprising, since Donnelly was obsessed with the idea of hidden truths and historical cover-ups, that he would be drawn to this topic, and predictable that he would focus almost entirely on the idea of the works of Shakespeare being secretly encoded. His work would go on to inspire a generation of Baconian cipher seekers who believed they could decrypt secret messages in Shakespeare. Donnelly was no cryptologist, and he went about his work rather backward, imagining what Bacon's secret message might be and then searching for it in acrostics. The notion that a work might be misattributed and that the true author's signature might be discerned in an acrostic, taking the first letters of certain words, was not actually a fringe idea. Indeed, within a decade of the appearance of Donnelly's book, a work long attributed to Chaucer would be discovered to have been authored by one Thomas Uske, because of just such an acrostic signature hidden within it. But Donnelly was forced to choose rather arbitrary key words, separated each time by a rather arbitrary number of characters, for his acrostics to work, and he often miscounted purposely in order to make the text fit his preconceived secret message. Donnelly also imagined how Bacon would have had to lay out his pages in such a fashion as to make sure that each key word was in the right position, but in doing so he betrayed a clear ignorance of how Elizabethan printing worked. These problems would continue to plague all the theories of later cipher seekers, as would Donnelly's eventual obsession with finding the original manuscripts of Shakespeare's works. Authorship theorists regularly point to the absence of manuscripts as some indication that the man from Stratford had not written the works attributed to him, despite the fact that manuscripts of plays written for the stage were often not preserved, since plays could be viewed as a performance art rather than a literary art. Remember that Shakespeare's collected plays would not be published in the first folio until years after his death. But to cipher seekers, the absence of manuscripts was somehow proof that they contained evidence of the code written into them, and they imagined that Sir Francis Bacon had hidden them away like buried treasure. This is the origin of the absurd notion that Shakespearean manuscripts are buried on Oak Island. Donnelly believed the manuscripts to be buried on Bacon's estate, but could never convince Bacon's descendants to let him dig up the grounds. After Donnelly came Orville Owen, a Detroit doctor who claimed that he had found some sort of encrypted manual for decoding Bacon's code, which he had decoded. So he decoded the key to the code he needed to decode, which, as one skeptic pointed out, seemed, quote, like picking the lock of a safe only to find the key to the lock you have already picked, end quote. Owen claimed that the decoded message instructed him to build a device with wheels on which he would lay out Shakespeare's plays and spin the text past his eyes in such a way that key words would jump out. As with Donnelly's arbitrary selection of key words, though, Owen baked into his conception of the code much laxity, in that when he found a key word, it would be possible to find the actual encoded terms or phrases several lines away, giving him great swaths of text in which to find whatever he wanted to find. His assistant in this work, Elizabeth Gallop, would eventually become a rival, believing that Bacon had also woven in a biliteral code through his use of two distinct fonts. Owen's and especially Gallop's theories both suffered from the same problem as Donnelly's, in that they depended on the notion that the play's author had been closely involved with the actual printing work performed by compositors. But Gallop's theory specifically would later be entirely disproven when it was pointed out that Elizabethan compositors typically worked with trays full of lots of different typefaces, explaining the variation in font that she suspected was a code. The codes that Owen and Gallop believed they were uncovering led them to pretty outrageous conclusions. According to them, the play's cipher revealed that Sir Francis Bacon was really Queen Elizabeth's son and thus heir to the throne. And Gallop's non-existent biliteral code took it a step further, revealing that within the plays were encoded other lost plays of Shakespeare that told the history of Elizabethan England, including tragedies about Mary, Queen of Scots, and Anne Boleyn, both of which I'd have loved to read. Unfortunately, Gallop only provided summaries of these plays she had supposedly found buried within other plays, taking the idea of a play within a play to absurd heights. Eventually, their decipherment led both Owen and Gallop to the location of the hidden Shakespeare manuscripts. Gallop's code sent her to North London and Canonbury Tower, while Owen's took him to the bottom of the Severn River. Unsurprisingly, neither of them found a single page. Throughout the twilight of Twain's career and lifetime, a number of other books were released on the topic. Francis Bacon, Our Shakespeare by Edwin Reed in 1902, The Shakespeare Problem Restated by George Greenwood in 1908, and in 1909, the year before Twain's passing, he had the opportunity to read the pre-publication galleys of a new book making further claims about Baconian codes in Shakespeare, called Some Acrostic Signatures of Francis Bacon by William Stone Booth. By the end of his life, Twain had become thoroughly convinced that Shakespeare could not have written the works attributed to him, his conclusions leaning heavily on the fact of the sparse biographical records of the man, saying, quote, "He is a brontosaur, 9 bones, and 600 barrels of plaster of Paris," end quote. Nor was Twain alone among his literary contemporaries in succumbing to the Baconian authorship theory. Walt Whitman, who loved the idea of the mundane world being infused with some mystical secret, wrote the poem Shakespeare Bacon's Cipher, which begins with the words, "I doubt it not." And Twain's close friend, Helen Keller, who had once written, quote, "My Shakespeare was so strongly entrenched against Baconian arguments that he could never be dislodged," end quote, would eventually propose to write a book of her own in support of those same Baconian arguments, something she thankfully never did. As for Twain, so preoccupied was he with conspiracy claims about Shakespeare that he tried to come up with a few similar such theories himself, arguing at one point that The Pilgrim's Progress could not have been written by the preacher John Bunyan and must instead have been authored by John Milton. At one point, he even tried to argue that Queen Elizabeth was really a man, because no woman could have accomplished what she did. At the end, the Shakespeare authorship question had become such an obsession that he made it the subject of his final work, which he called Is Shakespeare Dead? In it, he plagiarized an entire chapter from another writer, lifting a whole section about Shakespeare's apparent knowledge of the law from another book that he failed to credit. So at the end of his illustrious career, the Shakespeare authorship controversy led him to folly and scandal. As James Shapiro points out in my principal source, Contested Will, Twain seems to have plagiarized that section because it makes a convincing case that Shakespeare could not have had the legal knowledge that the author of the plays displays. As Shapiro puts it, Twain borrowed the material, quote, to challenge Shakespeare's claims to authorship on the grounds that you had to know about law to speak with authority about it. Yet in doing so, Twain does what Shakespeare himself had done: appropriate what others said or wrote, using their words to lend authority to his own, something that Twain had argued wasn't possible, end quote. Shapiro goes on to note the further irony that Twain believed Shakespeare to be illiterate because he left no books behind. Yet after his own death, Twain's own book collection was immediately sold off by executors looking to make a quick profit, much as might have been the case with Shakespeare's library. In the end, with no convincing evidence of a cipher, no lost manuscripts, nor any compelling evidence to show that Bacon wrote any plays, let alone that the language of Shakespeare's plays could be likened to his own work, the Baconian heresy faded, only to reappear far later with the advent of History Channel nonsense and the conspiracy-addled internet. But the authorship controversy would not fade. It merely needed a new candidate. And it turned out there was no shortage of them. Thank you for listening to Historical Blindness. Check out my principal source for this episode, James Shapiro's Contested Will, Who Wrote Shakespeare. Check out the blog post for this episode, which should go up on historicalblindness.com before the next episode releases, with a transcript, related imagery, and citations for further reading. As always, thanks go out to my partner patrons, Diane Lane, Robert Fisher, Joe Escott, Sean Munger, Devlin Hoff, Michael Markham, Jessica Reeves, Fred R. Groteis, Robin Naggett, Rebecca, Don Mundus, Eunice Allen Bradley, Juliet O'Connor, Jonathan Williams, Joshua Luddington, Logan Houlihan, Lily Powers, John Gowen, Lonnie Coffer, Ralph Fenn, Emma, Kevin Osborne, Ed Shockley, Benny Slater, That One Girl, Jocelyn Clausen, Lindsay McAllister, and Christine LeBlanc. Thank you all for listening. And remember, the text of my episodes is available as blog posts on historicalblindness.com. If one of you were to go through it with a fine-toothed comb, picking random words in order to create some acrostic, I'm quite sure you could uncover nearly any hidden message that you wanted to find buried in the text. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows, like The Constant and The Conspirators. Some music on this episode was licensed through a Blue Dot Sessions blanket license at the time of the episode's publication. Additional music is by Kai Engel, licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Check out the show notes for a list of the tracks used. You can support the show by pledging on Patreon or by making a one-time donation on PayPal. Find those links in the show notes, or find me on Venmo at Historical Blindness. Until next time, remember, according to the infinite monkey theorem, given enough monkeys hitting random keys on typewriters, the complete works of Shakespeare will almost surely be produced. I'm not certain of the accuracy of that, though the phrase almost surely is a nice qualifier. But I am sure that given enough cipher seekers monkeying around with the text of Shakespeare's works, absolutely any coded message can be found within them.
All you need is a few minutes to start your day off with something historic when you listen to the This Day in History podcast. Every day there's a new episode for you to listen and learn about what happened that day way back when. So listen and subscribe to This Day in History wherever you get your podcasts. That's This Day in History wherever you get your podcasts.
Spend less time staying in the know about all things gaming and more time actually watching and playing what you want with the IGN Daily Update podcast. All you need is a few minutes to hear the latest from IGN on the world of video games, movies, and television with news, previews, and reviews. So listen and subscribe to the IGN Daily Update wherever you get your podcasts. That's the IGN Daily Update wherever you get your podcasts.